All right, we're going to continue our look today at Cold War foreign policy by shifting from Truman to Eisenhower. As you remember, our main look at Cold War foreign policy so far has been focused on containment. What we talked about in class is maybe the easiest example of containment is the Korean War. Containment policy put into action is the Korean War. The North Koreans invaded South Korea, so communism was spreading. So we went to war to try and push it back. There were other non-war examples, such as giving money through the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan. There was building alliances through NATO, and other things that we talked about. And so the question that we discussed in class is, did these efforts work? And you could answer yes or no. Someone who would say yes, the containment policy worked, would say, did communism spread to Western Europe? Nope, it did not, so containment policy was successful. Somebody may also say, no, containment policy didn't work. The Soviet Union exploded an atomic bomb and got stronger in that way. China turned communist. So communism spread to East Asia. And there was a lot of fear of communism spreading in the United States, as evidenced by HUAC and McCarthyism and other things. So because of these perceived failings, especially on the part of Republicans, Truman was seen as weak and passive. And so therefore it shouldn't surprise us that his successor, Eisenhower, then seeks to and accomplishes his goal of projecting strength. And we can talk about whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. So when Eisenhower becomes president in 1953, he brings along with him three main tactics to oppose the expansion of communism overseas, or the threat of communism overseas. First of all, he wants to set up security and trade agreements, essentially continue building alliances. Some of these are going to be economic as well, so that would, in theory, put the United States in a more clearly advantageous position with respect to their relationship with other countries. They're going to use some covert action, use the newly created or fairly newly created CIA to set up favorable governments in other countries. This led to the United States supporting, yes, dictators, though not communist dictators, but dictators nonetheless, that since the 1950s has by many been determined to be maybe less than great. And then the big one is going to be the threat of nuclear war, that should the Soviet Union or any communist country attack the United States or one of her allies, there is going to be a nuclear war, so maybe cool your jets on that stuff. This acronym MAD stands for Mutually Assured Destruction, so that even if one atomic weapon is fired against the United States, the full arsenal of weapons will be launched against the enemy and its allies. So, maybe don't even do that one. That's the idea here. So there's some key players here. The first is, and we'll get to President Eisenhower in a second, but one is John Foster Dulles. He's the Secretary of State. He favored more forceful tactics. He's seen as a response to the perceived weakness and passiveness of Truman. And so what he wants to be, he sees the people of Eastern Europe as being held captive by communism and by those authoritarian governments, so he wants to set them free. And that's going to take active, aggressive tactics in order to accomplish that. President Eisenhower feels largely the same way, but he at the same time wants to reduce the military budget, so any kind of military expansion that could potentially help, liberate those captive people is going to be tricky. So we essentially kind of have two competing visions here. Do we have strength, or do we reduce the size of the military? Well, one way to accomplish both visions is that massive nuclear threat. You can continue to build a nuclear arsenal. You don't even necessarily have to build the nuclear arsenal. You can just make it more of a viable threat that the United States is going to utilize that arsenal. And then that should, in theory, deter aggressive action on the part of our enemies. And you see the phrase here, more bang for the buck. Don't have to spend a lot to potentially curb Soviet and communist aggression overseas. So it's kind of an interesting idea there. Now, in 1953, Joseph Stalin dies. He's replaced by Nikita Khrushchev, who brings along with him some interesting ideas. He wants to modernize the Soviet regime. For Stalin, who gained power in the early to mid-1920s, it shouldn't be surprising that there was some stagnation there. And the older a ruler like Stalin gets, he's not going to necessarily want to change and modernize. So now is a chance through a youngish leader like Khrushchev to move the Soviet Union forward in a new direction. And so he focuses on ideas such as providing adequate consumer goods to his people. That would boost morale, that could boost productivity. He also wants to ease tensions in Eastern Europe. He's not necessarily as interested in using the iron fist as Stalin was to keep the Soviet bloc in line, which causes some problems for him later on. So there seems to be some maybe positive developments. On the other hand, he's a bit of a nut. Sometimes he's really friendly and boisterous and laughing and almost giggling at times. Other times he's acting like a crazy person and banging his shoe on the podium of the General Assembly of the United Nations while giving a speech. And flies off the handle, so you don't necessarily know what to expect with Khrushchev. One negative aspect from Khrushchev's perspective of his seeming easing of these tensions is that certain Eastern European factions or countries anyway, can sort of maybe see this as an opening to push for more independence and move away from the Soviet Union. Well, authoritarian governments like the Soviet Union are not interested in these countries having more independence and want to keep them in line. So one such movement for more independence happened in Hungary, and this moved far enough along that it was ultimately crushed by the Soviets when they rolled in tanks in 1956 and squashed that uprising. So the lesson from that was, maybe for the Soviet Union was maybe don't even allow that opening in the first place. And so authoritarianism sort of returned. For all of his talk, for all of his boastfulness of trying to use force to free the people of Eastern Europe, Dulles didn't do anything here, which maybe shouldn't surprise us because that could lead to a war. In terms of non-European countries or non-European concerns, in the Middle East, there was a dispute in Egypt that had to do with the canal. The story itself isn't as important as what resulted from the story, which is what we refer to as the Eisenhower Doctrine, which states that if the United States sees a need for its intervention in the Middle East, we're going to send our troops there, which is an area of the world up to that point, other than the creation of Israel, that the United States really hasn't been involved, and one could argue has been constantly involved with since. So it's an interesting interventionist direction that the United States is taking. In Latin America, there is growing inequality, growing social tensions, as evidenced by this one statistic where 2% of the people control 75% of the land. People are starting to get frustrated there. A good example of that is Cuba. As we know from the Platt Amendment after the Spanish-American War, the United States was very influential in Cuba, and Cuba at the time had a dictator that was very close with the United States, which for people who were in positions of power was very good, but for everyday Cubans wasn't as good, and they started to grow resentful of the United States' influence in Cuba and saw themselves as harmed by that influence. So along comes a youngish revolutionary named Fidel Castro, who led this movement of the people at the bottom of society, the disadvantaged, which is very similar to what we saw in what would become the Soviet Union in the 19-teens, driving the elite from power, replacing it with representatives, supposed representatives of the people, even if they went on to do it in brutal fashion. That was seen as better than all this outside influence. Now, a lot of Americans initially were okay with it. They didn't necessarily care, but when Castro started to move towards communism and put communists in positions of power, America grew kind of nervous, especially given Cuba's close geographical proximity to the United States and the Soviet Union potentially having an ally near the United States was very concerning. This action of putting communists in position of power led to a sugar embargo, and that then pushed Castro towards the Soviet Union. And when we talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, this is one of the first steps that leads to something like that. Now, to finish up, just a couple domestic contributions that also are tied in with maybe national security concerns. One is the Interstate Highway Act of 1956. We talked about earlier, we talked about the importance of that in terms of economic development in the United States, but also there's defense considerations there. If there's military need on one side of the country, the interstates could be shut down, and military resources could be transferred from one side of the country to the other in an easier fashion than if the interstates weren't there in the first place. There's also the reaction to Sputnik, called the National Defense Education Act, which provided more resources for math and science education in schools. So these two ostensible domestic laws did have national security implications also, as did a lot of things during the 1950s and the Cold War in general. So that's it for this presentation. As always, please let me know if you have any questions.